Evelyn Grayson drifted through her home, a sprawling estate that spoke of money in a way that was somehow both grand and quiet. To any outsider, her life seemed like the pinnacle of perfection, luxurious, stable, flawless. She was the wife of Richard Grayson, one of the city's wealthiest and most influential men, and her days were filled with charity galas, socialite gatherings, and dinners with people whose names carried weight across state lines. But despite the glittering exterior, Evelyn felt herself slipping, suffocated beneath a life that sparkled like glass yet cut like steel. As she crossed the marble foyer, a portrait caught her eye. It was one of her and Richard, taken at a fundraiser 2 years ago. They looked polished, every hair in place, their expressions set in practiced smiles. She remembered how she had felt that night, standing beside him, a part of him yet not truly seen by him. That's what life with Richard had become. A role to be played, a carefully rehearsed performance. Evelyn had never wanted for anything material. Richard had given her everything she could have asked for and then some. Yet beneath the diamonds, the designer gowns, and the meticulously decorated rooms, there was a hollow ache she couldn't ignore any longer. Her friends would call her mad if she ever admitted to feeling dissatisfied. Who could understand that a woman with everything felt as though she had nothing? But Richard had built an empire by controlling every detail, and their marriage was no exception. He controlled his businesses, his image, and, in many ways, Evelyn herself. She was expected to look beautiful, to smile on cue, and to attend every function with grace. But beyond that, he had little use for her. Sometimes, she felt more like a fixture in his life than a partner. As Evelyn wandered into the sitting room, she picked up a crystal glass from the bar and poured herself a splash of whiskey. The rich, amber liquid settled in the glass, and she let the burns slide down her throat, trying to find warmth in a home that felt increasingly cold. She could remember the first time she'd stepped into this house, how the sheer scale of it had taken her breath away. Now it felt as vast as a prison. It wasn't as though she hadn't tried to reach Richard, to salvage some semblance of connection between them. She'd hinted at the loneliness she felt, tried to show him her vulnerability, but her attempts were met with indifference. Richard's gaze would slide away, his mind already on his next deal or strategic move. She knew he saw her dissatisfaction as a failure on her part, a weakness, perhaps even a betrayal of the life he had given her. The silence of the house pressed in, broken only by the distant hum of staff attending to their duties. Evelyn glanced out the window, watching the manicured lawns and pristine gardens, the world Richard had built for them. She felt herself sinking beneath the weight of it all, as if she were drowning in expectations and appearances. Her phone buzzed, breaking her reverie. It was an invitation to yet another gala, another night of small talk and superficiality. She set the phone down without replying. The idea of facing another evening of hollow laughter and forced smiles was unbearable. A part of her wanted to escape, to walk out of the gilded cage and leave it all behind. But where would she go? Who would she be if she wasn't Mrs. Richard Grayson? It was a question that haunted her, one she was too afraid to answer. Evelyn finished her drink and set the glass down, her eyes drifting back to the portrait in the foyer. She looked at the woman she'd become, poised, polished, perfect, and felt a surge of resentment. It wasn't only against Richard. It was against herself, for allowing this life to consume her, for playing her part so well that she had forgotten what it was like to feel anything real. But something stirred within her, a quiet, desperate yearning for something beyond these walls, something that was hers and hers alone. She didn't know what form it would take or where it would lead her, but the ache in her heart was becoming too loud to ignore. There had to be something more than this, something she could touch, something that would make her feel alive again. As the light began to fade outside, casting long shadows across the room, Evelyn turned away from the window. Her life was perfect, yes, but perfection could be a cruel illusion, one that blinded you to the emptiness underneath. Tonight, she told herself, was just like every other night. And yet, somewhere deep within, she felt the first stirring of change, like the faintest whisper of a storm gathering on the horizon. Evelyn barely registered the sound of jazz filtering through the high ceilings as she stepped into the gallery, already scanning the room for familiar faces. She attended these events regularly, an obligation more than a choice, but tonight, something felt different, a faint hum of energy she couldn't place. She moved past paintings and sculptures, each one a piece she'd seen 100 times, barely glancing at the polished faces surrounding her. Her friend Serena caught her eye, lifting a glass in a mock toast. Evelyn managed to smile in return, but her heart wasn't in it. She was about to move on when a piece near the far corner of the gallery drew her in, a canvas streaked with bold, chaotic colors. It was as though the artist had poured their soul onto the surface, raw and unfiltered. "That's one of my favorite pieces," a voice said beside her, low and warm, pulling her from her thoughts. Evelyn turned, her gaze landing on a man standing just a step too close, a half-smile lifting the corner of his mouth. He was striking, not in the groomed, polished way of the men she usually encountered, but with a ruggedness that made him stand out. His dark skin, deep-set eyes, and confident stance held a quiet intensity, and she found herself caught off guard by the unexpected warmth in his gaze. "It's haunting," she replied, surprised by her own honesty. He chuckled, a soft, almost reverent sound. "That's exactly what I wanted." A small thrill shot through her as she processed his words. "You're the artist?" He nodded, extending a hand. "Marcus Gray." She took his hand, feeling a strange sense of connection at the warmth of his grip. "Evelyn Grayson." "Ah," he said, and there was a slight change in his expression, a subtle shift she couldn't quite read. "A pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Grayson." It struck her how he held her gaze, not with the superficial courtesy she was accustomed to but with genuine interest, as though he saw beyond her title, beyond her role. She wasn't used to being seen this way, and the realization left her feeling both exposed and intrigued. "I wasn't expecting to meet the artist tonight," she said, letting her hand linger in his for a moment longer than she should have. "Your work, it's unlike anything else in this gallery." He smiled, a quiet pride in his eyes. "Thank you. It's not always easy to find a place for work that isn't exactly polite." There was something daring in his words, a challenge just beneath the surface. Evelyn could feel her pulse quicken as she allowed herself to step into this new territory, intrigued by his openness, his willingness to be unapologetically himself. "Do you think art should be polite?" she asked, surprising herself with the question. He laughed softly. "Art should be honest. Politeness is for those who have something to hide." Her gaze drifted back to his painting, the colors swirling with a reckless abandon that mirrored the turmoil within her. She thought of her own life, its pristine surface hiding cracks that grew deeper every day. She wondered what her life would look like if it were captured on canvas, if she, too, could be honest without the layers of composure she wore like armor. "Would you tell me about it?" she asked, gesturing to the painting. "What inspired you?" Marcus's face softened, and he stepped closer, just enough that his arm brushed hers. His voice dropped, as if sharing a secret meant only for her. "It's about freedom," he said, and she heard something raw in his voice. "About breaking through everything that's expected of you and letting yourself feel, really feel." The words hit her like a blow, and she had to fight to keep her composure. When was the last time she truly felt anything? She couldn't even remember. The longing for something real, something that could shake her awake, pulsed within her. A moment of silence passed, and she became acutely aware of how close they were standing, of the way his gaze held hers as though waiting for her response. But before she could answer, Serena approached, breaking the spell. "Evelyn, there you are." "I was beginning to think you'd vanished," Serena said, casting a curious glance at Marcus. Evelyn managed a polite smile, slipping back into the role she knew so well. "I was just admiring Marcus's work." "Ah, an artist," Serena said with a dismissive nod, already half interested as her eyes roamed the gallery. "Shall we, Evelyn?" Evelyn hesitated, looking back at Marcus. "Thank you," she said softly, though she wasn't sure if she was thanking him for his art or for the glimpse of something she hadn't felt in years. He nodded, a knowing look in his eyes. "I hope to see you again, Evelyn." As she walked away with Serena, his words echoed in her mind, lingering long after she'd left the gallery. The warmth of his presence, his honesty, his freedom. It was like a thread tugging at her, pulling her away from the polished surfaces of her life and towards something unknown. The next week, Evelyn found herself returning to the gallery. She told herself she was only there to appreciate the art, to recapture the thrill of seeing something unfiltered and genuine. But beneath the surface, she knew the real reason: Marcus Gray. She didn't have to look far. Marcus was in the same corner, inspecting his work with a quiet intensity. When he noticed her, his expression softened, a faint smile appearing as he stepped forward. "Back so soon, Mrs. Grayson?" The title made her wince, a reminder of the boundaries that stretched between them. Yet the way he looked at her, direct, curious, without judgment, made her forget those boundaries, even if just for a moment. "Couldn't stay away," she replied, attempting a lightness she didn't feel. "Your work, it has a way of drawing people in. Or maybe it's something else that brought you back," he suggested, his eyes locking with hers. There was a warmth there, but also a challenge, as if he was inviting her to confront something she didn't want to face. Evelyn swallowed, feeling her pulse quicken. "Maybe it is," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. They moved to a quiet alcove, away from the scattered visitors browsing the gallery. As they talked, the conversation flowed effortlessly, each word a bridge to a world she'd forgotten existed. They spoke about art, yes, but also about life, about the things that gave it meaning. Evelyn found herself laughing, genuinely laughing, for the first time in months. With Marcus, she felt seen, not as Mrs. Richard Grayson, the billionaire's wife, but as Evelyn, a woman with dreams and desires that had been stifled and buried under layers of expectation. His presence was like a doorway to something she had been afraid to confront: the possibility of a life that was hers, truly hers. Their encounters grew more frequent, each one more intimate than the last. They met at hidden cafes, quiet parks, and even an abandoned rooftop Marcus had converted into a makeshift studio. The thrill of secrecy, of slipping into a world where no one recognized her, was intoxicating. And as each day passed, she felt herself inching further from the life she had known, the life she had played her part in so perfectly. One evening, as they stood on the rooftop watching the city lights flicker to life, Marcus turned to her, his expression softened by the glow of twilight. "Evelyn," he murmured, his voice a tender note in the night, "I don't want to overstep, but what are we doing here?" She looked at him, her heart pounding. The question was one she'd avoided, not wanting to define what they had for fear it might break the spell. But standing there, beneath the open sky, she felt a strange sense of freedom, a courage that only Marcus seemed to bring out in her. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the city below. "All I know is that with you, I feel alive. I haven't felt that way in a long time." His gaze held hers, searching, as if he was weighing her words, feeling the depth of them. Slowly, he reached for her hand, his fingers warm against hers. She didn't pull away. Instead, she felt herself drawn closer, caught in the quiet intimacy of the moment. As they stood there, hands intertwined, Evelyn was struck by the gravity of her choices. She was teetering on the edge of something she couldn't name, something that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. But in Marcus's presence, the fear seemed to melt away, replaced by a reckless courage she hadn't known she possessed. Marcus leaned in, his lips brushing hers in a tentative, lingering kiss. It was a gentle meeting, filled with an unspoken understanding that whatever this was, it was real, something raw and true, untouched by the polished illusions of her life with Richard. Evelyn felt herself surrendering to it, to him, as if, for the first time, she was stepping into a world where she could be fully herself. They pulled apart, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence filled only by the whisper of the wind and the hum of the city below. Evelyn's mind raced, flooded with emotions she couldn't contain, a mixture of guilt, exhilaration, and something close to joy. "What happens now?" she finally asked, her voice trembling. Marcus squeezed her hand, his gaze unwavering. "That's up to you, Evelyn. I'm here because I want to be. But you, You have to decide what this means." The weight of his words settled over her, both a comfort and a challenge. Evelyn knew the risks. She knew that a life with Marcus would be a life outside the confines of everything she'd been taught to value. But as she looked into his eyes, she felt a stirring of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to make it work. As the night deepened, Evelyn left the rooftop with a sense of possibility she hadn't felt in years. She knew this was dangerous, knew she was walking a tightrope between two worlds, one bound by duty, the other by desire. But for the first time, she was willing to risk it, willing to let herself fall into something beyond her carefully controlled life. In the weeks that followed, their connection grew. Evelyn found herself living for the stolen moments with Marcus, each one a temporary escape from the sterile perfection of her life with Richard. The more time she spent with Marcus, the harder it became to return to the polished shell of her marriage. And as she lay in bed at night, her thoughts lingering on Marcus's touch, she knew that she was crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. The life she'd known was slipping away, and she was powerless to stop it. Evelyn knew she should have felt guilt, or at the very least, hesitation. Yet with each secret meeting, each stolen moment with Marcus, she felt a strange liberation growing within her, a fierce desire she hadn't felt in years. The life she had known, the constraints of being Mrs. Richard Grayson, seemed to fall away whenever she was with him. He looked at her not as a possession, not as a polished accessory, but as someone worth knowing, worth understanding. And in that, she found a strength she didn't realize she possessed. One rainy afternoon, Evelyn met Marcus at a small, hidden cafe tucked away from the prying eyes of high society. The dim lighting and quiet hum of jazz created an intimacy that made the world outside feel distant, almost unreal. They sat in a corner booth, cocooned in the warm glow, as the rain pattered softly against the windows. "I feel like I'm living someone else's life when I'm with you," Evelyn confessed, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee cup. She looked up, meeting Marcus's gaze, and saw a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "Maybe it's the life you were always meant to live," he replied softly, reaching across the table to take her hand. His words settled over her, resonating with a truth she'd long buried. With Marcus, she was free to be more than just a role, more than just the trophy wife in Richard's carefully constructed world. Here, she was simply Evelyn, a woman with thoughts, dreams, desires. They lingered over their drinks, sharing stories, small glimpses into each other's lives. Marcus told her about his work, his struggles to find a place in the art world, the challenges he faced. He didn't hide his vulnerabilities, and that openness made her feel closer to him, made her want to share parts of herself she'd never dared to reveal. As the afternoon waned and the cafe began to empty, Marcus leaned closer, his eyes intent, searching. "Come with me," he whispered, his voice barely audible, yet laced with a promise that set her heart racing. Without a word, she followed him outside, their footsteps splashing in the puddles left by the rain. He led her to his apartment, a small but inviting space filled with canvases, brushes, and the lingering scent of paint. It was a world away from the pristine, soulless rooms of her home with Richard, and as she stepped inside, she felt a strange sense of belonging, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. Marcus closed the door behind her, and for a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of what they were about to do settling over them. But in that silence, she felt a certainty, a clarity she couldn't deny. She reached out, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath her touch. Marcus met her gaze, his eyes dark with longing, and slowly, he pulled her closer. Their kiss was gentle at first, a tentative exploration, but soon it deepened, driven by a need that had been building for weeks. In his arms, she felt a release, a letting go of all the expectations and obligations that had weighed her down. Here, in this moment, there was no one else, nothing else, only them. Time seemed to blur as they moved together, each touch igniting something dormant within her. She felt alive, unbound, as though she were finally stepping into her own life rather than living as an accessory in someone else's. Later, as they lay together in the soft glow of the fading afternoon light, Evelyn felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She traced her fingers along Marcus's arm, marveling at the ease between them, the way their silences felt as natural as their conversations. "I could stay like this forever," she murmured, more to herself than to him. Marcus turned to her, a hint of sadness in his eyes. "I wish you could." The reality of her life, of her marriage, hovered like a shadow over them. She knew this moment couldn't last, knew that the life she'd chosen would soon pull her back into its grasp. And yet, a part of her refused to believe that what they had could be so fleeting. For the next few weeks, Evelyn and Marcus lived in a world of their own making, a world that existed outside the boundaries of duty and decorum. They met in hidden places, exchanged stolen glances at public events, and shared whispered conversations that belonged only to them. With him, she felt real, whole, as though she was finally reclaiming something she'd lost long ago. But the deeper she sank into her affair with Marcus, the more complicated her emotions became. The exhilaration of being with him, the thrill of secrecy, was intoxicating, yet it brought with it a creeping fear, a fear of discovery, of the consequences that awaited if Richard ever found out. And beneath that fear, there was guilt, a gnawing sense of betrayal she tried to ignore. Still, Evelyn couldn't bring herself to stop. Her meetings with Marcus became an escape, a lifeline in the sterile, empty world of her marriage. She became adept at hiding her emotions, at slipping between the roles of devoted wife and secret lover. And with each encounter, her bond with Marcus grew stronger, more intense, until he was no longer just an affair, but a necessity, a part of her she couldn't imagine living without. Yet in the quiet hours of the night, as she lay beside Richard, Evelyn felt a tension building within her, a sense of something inevitable approaching. She knew she was playing a dangerous game, that the life she'd built was precarious, hanging by a thread. But the pull of freedom, the chance to feel alive, was too powerful to resist. As the days passed, Evelyn felt the duality of her life intensify, each choice drawing her further away from the safety of her old life and closer to the edge of something unknown. Evelyn had always been skilled at maintaining appearances, but lately, each day felt like a tightrope walk. Her life was a carefully constructed performance, with Marcus waiting in the shadows, just out of sight. At home, she would glide through her responsibilities, projecting the image of a devoted wife, but her mind was constantly pulled back to him, her secret life unfolding like pages of a novel only she could read. One evening, she found herself at yet another charity event with Richard, her arm tucked around his as they made their way through the glimmering ballroom. She was dressed in a gown he had picked out for her, and as she moved through the crowd, she felt the familiar sense of detachment, as if she were watching herself from a distance. Yet tonight, something felt different. She noticed Richard's eyes on her, a glint of something unreadable beneath his polished smile. His grip on her arm was firmer than usual, his voice edged with tension as he greeted their guests. Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her more closely, as if searching for something hidden. As the evening wore on, she caught herself glancing toward the corners of the room, half expecting to see Marcus there, though she knew he wouldn't be. Still, the thrill of their meetings lingered in her mind, a warmth she clung to amidst the chill of her surroundings. When they returned home that night, Richard's behavior shifted. Normally, he would retreat to his study, burying himself in work. But tonight, he lingered, watching her as she removed her jewelry, each movement slow and deliberate. Evelyn felt a prickle of unease, sensing the weight of his gaze. "Evelyn," he said finally, his voice soft but carrying a strange undertone. "You've seemed distracted lately." She forced herself to smile, her heart pounding. "Just busy with the charity, Richard. You know how demanding these events can be." He nodded, but the intensity in his eyes didn't waver. "I'm sure you're handling it wonderfully, as always." His tone was calm, yet something about it unsettled her. "Still, I can't help but wonder if there's anything else occupying your mind." The question hung in the air, and Evelyn felt her pulse quicken. She met his gaze, her face carefully composed, but inwardly, she was reeling. Did he know? Had he somehow pieced together the truth? "Richard, what do you mean?" she asked, striving to keep her voice steady. He smiled, a practiced expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Nothing, dear. I simply wanted to remind you of the responsibilities we have, to each other, to the family." He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "After all, loyalty is what holds everything together. Wouldn't you agree?" Evelyn forced herself to hold his gaze, a chill running through her. She knew Richard was a man who valued control above all else, who kept a close watch on his world. The idea that he might suspect her affair made her feel as though the walls were closing in. In the days that followed, Evelyn found herself more cautious, more aware of every step she took. She could feel the weight of Richard's presence even when he wasn't there, a shadow that loomed over her, making her hyper-aware of every glance, every stray movement. She began to notice the subtle ways he was watching her, the questions that lingered just below the surface of their conversations. Her meetings with Marcus grew more intense, tinged with a new urgency. She told him about Richard's behavior, the way he seemed to hover just beyond her line of sight, watching and waiting. Marcus listened, his expression serious, but he encouraged her to stay calm, reassuring her that they were careful, that there was no reason to worry. But Evelyn couldn't shake the growing sense of dread. She found herself scanning the crowds at every event, every gathering, wary of unseen eyes that might be following her. Her life had become a web of secrets and lies, and she was beginning to feel the strain. One afternoon, as she sat with Marcus in his apartment, she confessed her fears, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if he knows?" she asked, her fingers twisting anxiously. "What if he's just waiting to catch me?" Marcus reached for her hands, steadying her with a gentle squeeze. "We're careful, Evelyn," he murmured, his eyes filled with calm reassurance. "He can't suspect anything unless we let him. Just trust me." She wanted to believe him, to let his confidence soothe her fears. But even as she nodded, a part of her remained on edge, haunted by the lingering suspicion that Richard was closer to the truth than she dared to admit. As she left Marcus's apartment that evening, Evelyn felt a sudden rush of paranoia, the sensation of being watched gnawing at her. She glanced over her shoulder, scanning the street, but saw only the usual bustle of the city, people lost in their own lives. Yet the feeling didn't leave her. At home, Richard's presence seemed to fill every corner of their vast estate. She felt his eyes on her, even in the quiet moments, as if he could sense the secrets she carried. And as she lay awake beside him at night, Evelyn knew that the illusion she had woven was beginning to fray, and the shadow of discovery loomed ever closer. Days slipped into weeks, and Evelyn's life became a tense balancing act. The thrill of her moments with Marcus remained, but the fear of discovery cast a shadow over every encounter, leaving her constantly on edge. Richard's behavior grew more unsettling, his questions more pointed, his presence more invasive, as though he was closing in on her carefully guarded secrets. One evening, Evelyn returned home to find Richard already waiting in the sitting room, a place he rarely used. He was seated in his usual composed manner, his hands folded, yet his expression was harder than she'd ever seen it. She felt a prickle of anxiety as his eyes met hers, cold and calculating. "Evelyn," he began, his voice unnervingly calm. "We need to talk." Evelyn forced herself to remain composed, slipping off her coat and crossing the room with measured steps. "Of course," she replied, settling into a chair opposite him. "What's on your mind?" He studied her, his gaze intense, as if he were dissecting her every move. "I've noticed you've been distant lately," he said, each word deliberate. "I can't help but wonder if something's wrong." Evelyn swallowed, a flicker of panic sparking within her. She knew he was testing her, looking for any sign of weakness, any hint of the truth lurking beneath her facade. But she couldn't let him see the cracks. She had to hold firm. "I've just been preoccupied with the charity events," she said smoothly, keeping her gaze steady. "They've taken up more time than I anticipated." Richard's lips curved into a thin smile, but there was no warmth in it. "Yes, I'm aware of how demanding your schedule has become." He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing slightly. "So much so that you've been keeping rather unusual hours." Her heart skipped a beat. She felt her control slipping, the weight of his words pressing down on her. But she took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm. "Unusual hours," she echoed, feigning innocence. "Yes," he replied, his voice edged with something dark and accusatory. "You've been coming home at odd times, disappearing for stretches during the day. I thought perhaps you'd grown restless." There was a charged silence between them, his insinuation hanging in the air like a challenge. Evelyn met his gaze, her mind racing to find an escape, a plausible explanation that wouldn't betray her. "Restless?" She let out a soft laugh, hoping it sounded genuine. "Richard, if I've seemed distracted, it's only because I wanted to ensure everything is perfect for the Foundation's next event. I hardly think I'm the type to be restless." His eyes flashed, and she sensed his frustration simmering just beneath the surface. She knew he didn't believe her, that he was simply waiting for her to slip, to confirm the suspicions that had clearly taken root in his mind. "Of course," he murmured, leaning back in his chair, though his gaze remained fixed on her. "I would hate to think that there was something you weren't telling me, Evelyn. After all, trust is everything. Wouldn't you agree?" Evelyn felt a chill run through her. She knew Richard was a man who valued loyalty above all else, who expected unwavering obedience from those around him. But the way he spoke now, the way he watched her, made it clear that he was no longer as confident in her loyalty as he once had been. "Yes," she replied quietly, her voice steady despite the fear churning within her. "Trust is everything." Satisfied, at least momentarily, Richard stood, his posture as controlled and formidable as ever. "Good," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Then I trust we'll see more of you at home." Evelyn managed a nod, her pulse racing as she watched him leave the room. The threat in his words was unmistakable. She knew she had to be more careful, that her every move would be scrutinized even more closely. The realization left her feeling trapped, as though her carefully constructed world was beginning to collapse around her. Over the following days, Evelyn noticed subtle changes in her environment. A maid would linger just a bit too long in the hallway outside her room. Her driver's eyes would follow her more closely in the rearview mirror. She began to feel as if she were constantly being watched, as though Richard had stationed invisible guards around her every step, waiting for her to slip up. Her meetings with Marcus became a game of strategy, each rendezvous planned with meticulous care to avoid any possibility of discovery. She would take indirect routes, change cars, and leave her phone behind, anything to ensure there was no trace of her actions. But the strain of it all began to wear on her, the constant fear and secrecy chipping away at the joy she once felt. One evening, as she sat with Marcus in his apartment, her nerves frayed, Evelyn felt the weight of it all bearing down on her. She couldn't hold back any longer, couldn't keep the fear bottled up inside. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I think he knows." Marcus looked at her, concern clouding his features. "Are you sure?" he asked gently, reaching for her hand. Evelyn shook her head, her voice barely audible. "No, but he's watching me. I can feel it. I think he's just waiting for me to make a mistake." He pulled her close, his arms a refuge against the storm she felt closing in around her. "Evelyn," he murmured, his voice filled with calm reassurance, "we'll get through this. We just have to be careful, more careful than we've ever been." She clung to his words, letting his calmness steady her racing heart. But deep down, she knew that each day they continued this dangerous game, the risk of discovery grew. She was walking a razor's edge, teetering between the life she had always known and the possibility of losing everything. As she left Marcus that evening, Evelyn's mind was consumed with Richard's words, his watchful gaze, the invisible trap she felt tightening around her. And for the first time, she began to wonder if freedom was worth the price she was about to pay. Evelyn had grown accustomed to feeling as if she were living on borrowed time. The mounting pressure of secrecy, of hiding her true self, made every day feel like a slow descent into darkness. But nothing could have prepared her for the moment when the thin thread she'd been balancing on finally snapped. It was a Sunday evening, and the house was unusually quiet. Richard had asked Evelyn to join him for dinner in the formal dining room, an uncommon request that set her nerves on edge. She dressed carefully, choosing a conservative gown and pinning her hair back in the way he preferred, knowing that tonight, every detail mattered. When she entered the dining room, Richard was already seated at the head of the long mahogany table. The silverware gleamed under the candlelight, and the air was thick with an unspoken tension. She took her seat across from him, her gaze lowered, feeling his eyes boring into her. He was silent as the courses were served, his focus unervingly fixed on her. Evelyn forced herself to eat, each bite mechanical, her mind racing with unease. Richard's silence felt like a countdown, each second stretching painfully as she waited for him to speak. Finally, after the main course was cleared, Richard set his glass down and leaned forward, his expression inscrutable. "I had a rather interesting conversation today," he began, his tone casual, though there was a deadly edge to his words. "Someone saw you out in the city, in a less reputable part of town." Evelyn felt the blood drain from her face, her fork slipping from her fingers and clattering against her plate. She tried to regain her composure, to feign confusion, but she knew she was failing. "Someone saw me," she managed, her voice barely more than a whisper. Richard's lips twisted into a smile that sent a chill down her spine. "Yes, they saw you with someone. A man. An artist, if I'm not mistaken." The room seemed to tilt around her, the walls closing in as her worst fears materialized. She had been so careful, taken every precaution, yet somehow Richard had found her out. She opened her mouth to deny it, to lie her way out, but the look in his eyes told her it was useless. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, grasping for some semblance of control. Richard's expression darkened, his smile vanishing as he leaned closer. "Don't insult my intelligence, Evelyn," he said, his voice cold and sharp. "I've known for weeks. I've been waiting for you to have the decency to come clean." The air was thick with the weight of her guilt, her betrayal laid bare in the piercing silence. She felt exposed, stripped of the facade she had so carefully maintained, and there was no escape from the truth. "Richard, she began, but her voice faltered. There were no words that could undo the damage, no apology that could soften the betrayal he must have felt. He straightened, his gaze hardening. "I gave you everything, Evelyn. A life of privilege, security, status. And this is how you repay me?" The accusation stung, and though shame clawed at her, a part of her bristled at his words, the possessiveness that underlined them. She realized, in that moment, that he hadn't felt betrayed by her affair. He'd felt betrayed by her disobedience, her failure to play her role. "Richard, I needed something real," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Something that wasn't about appearances, about control. With Marcus, I felt." "Marcus," he spat, the name dripping with contempt. "A man who can offer you nothing but a fantasy, a distraction from reality. You think he cares about you? You think he's not using you just as much as you've used him?" The words hit her like a blow, and Evelyn felt herself recoil, the bitterness in his tone cutting into her. She had known there would be consequences, that there would be a price to pay, but she hadn't expected it to hurt this much. Richard's voice softened, though his tone remained icy. "You've left me no choice, Evelyn. I won't tolerate this humiliation. Our marriage is over." The finality in his words sent a surge of panic through her. She knew that ending the marriage meant more than just separation. It meant losing the life she'd become accustomed to, the safety net she had relied upon. Richard controlled everything, the finances, the assets, the connections. Without him, she would be left with nothing. "Richard, please," she pleaded, desperation creeping into her voice. "I made a mistake, but we can work through this. We can find a way to." "There's nothing to work through," he interrupted coldly. "You broke the trust between us, and I don't forgive betrayal." He stood, his movements deliberate, calculated. "My lawyers will be in touch," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "You'll leave this house by the end of the week." The weight of his words settled over her, suffocating her as she realized the full extent of what he was saying. She had crossed a line, and now there was no going back. As he turned and left the room, Evelyn felt herself sink into her chair, the room spinning as the reality of her situation sank in. She was losing everything: her home, her security, her carefully constructed life. The fantasy she had built with Marcus had shattered, leaving her alone to face the consequences. In the silence that followed, Evelyn felt a surge of regret, a hollow ache that gnawed at her. She had wanted freedom, a taste of something real, but she hadn't anticipated the cost. And now, stripped of everything she had once valued, she was left with nothing but the bitter remnants of a choice that had destroyed her. Evelyn woke the next morning in a haze, the events of the previous night playing over and over in her mind like a nightmare she couldn't shake. She wandered through the house in a daze, each room feeling more like a stranger's home than her own. The familiar spaces, once symbols of her stability and status, now felt like cold monuments to a life she was about to lose. Richard's absence was more suffocating than his presence had ever been. He had left the house early, likely to meet with his lawyers, setting his plan into motion with the same ruthless efficiency he applied to his business deals. Evelyn knew that when he returned, she would no longer have a place here. Everything she had taken for granted, the wealth, the security, the identity of being Mrs. Grayson, was slipping through her fingers. By midday, her phone buzzed with a series of messages. They were from Richard's legal team, each one a formal statement detailing the terms of their impending divorce. The messages spelled out her immediate expulsion from the property, effective in a matter of days, and outlined her financial severance. Each line read like a sentence handed down in a court of law, her punishment written in legal language that masked its cruelty. With mounting dread, Evelyn scanned the terms, her fingers trembling. The prenuptial agreement left her with a pittance compared to the vast fortune Richard controlled. What she believed to be a safeguard of her independence was little more than a paper-thin shield. She would be left with enough to live on, yes, but it was nowhere near the comfort she had become accustomed to, nowhere near what she would need to keep her place in the world she'd always known. In a surge of desperation, Evelyn called the one person she could think of, Marcus. She barely waited for his greeting before her emotions spilled out. Marcus, he knows. Richard knows everything. He's kicking me out, and her voice cracked as she struggled to keep herself together. I have nothing. He's taken everything. There was a pause on the other end of the line before Marcus spoke, his voice a steady bomb in her storm of panic. Evelyn, calm down. We'll figure something out. You're not alone in this. But even as he said the words, Evelyn felt a sinking realization. She wasn't sure what she expected from him, perhaps some grand solution, an escape route she hadn't considered, but the practicality of Marcus's response deflated her. The gravity of her situation loomed larger than she'd anticipated, and she knew that no amount of comfort or promises could change what was coming. Meet me later? She whispered, needing the solace of his presence more than ever. I need to see you. They arranged to meet in the same small cafe where their connection had first taken root. As Evelyn entered, she was acutely aware of the stark contrast between this intimate, hidden place and the cold detachment of her life with Richard. Here, with Marcus, she had felt seen, understood. But now, with everything unraveling, the cafe felt different, fragile, like a place she might not be able to return to after today. When Marcus arrived, he pulled her into a quiet embrace, his arms offering a brief respite from the storm. She clung to him, her desperation spilling over, but when they sat down, she saw a flicker of concern in his eyes, a concern that wasn't just for her, but for what they both knew was coming. Evelyn, you can come stay with me if you need to, he offered, his voice gentle. But there was a hesitation in his words, an unspoken worry. Evelyn swallowed, feeling the sting of reality sinking deeper. I can't ask that of you, Marcus. You have your life, your work. I've already brought so much chaos into it. He reached across the table, taking her hands. You're not asking, Evelyn. I'm offering. We'll figure this out together. She nodded, grateful for his reassurance, though the doubt gnawed at her. She could sense his uncertainty, his fear of the consequences they both would have to face. And for the first time, she wondered if Marcus, too, would be unable to withstand the storm that was approaching. As they sat together, Evelyn's phone buzzed again. She glanced down to see a message from Richard's lawyer, a curt reminder that she was expected to vacate the property by the end of the week. The words were sharp, precise, and final. There would be no mercy, no negotiation. The life she had once known was being erased with surgical precision. Evelyn looked up at Marcus, her heart sinking. It's real. This is really happening. By the end of the week, I'll have nothing. Marcus squeezed her hands, his expression unwavering. You'll have me, Evelyn. I'm not going anywhere. But as much as she wanted to believe him, to find solace in his words, she couldn't ignore the creeping sense of dread that lingered beneath her skin. She knew that love alone might not be enough to save her from the consequences she now faced. When they finally left the cafe, Evelyn felt as though she were walking through a fog, her world collapsing around her, piece by piece. She clung to Marcus's hand, but the fear inside her grew with every step, an insistent reminder that the life she had once so carefully constructed was now slipping away, leaving her stranded in a future she could no longer control. Evelyn sat on the edge of her bed, surrounded by boxes and piles of clothes, each item a reminder of the life she was leaving behind. The end of the week loomed, and with it, the eviction notice that would force her out of her home, out of the carefully constructed identity she'd worn like armor. She felt like a ghost drifting through rooms that no longer belonged to her, each echoing with memories that were slipping further from her reach. Marcus had been her anchor in this storm, offering her a place to stay and a promise of support. She clung to that promise, desperate for a lifeline, as everything else in her life disintegrated. But as she packed the last of her belongings, Evelyn found herself haunted by Richard's words, by the contempt in his eyes as he'd torn her life apart. His accusations echoed in her mind, each one a barbed reminder of the choices she'd made, the secrets she'd buried. When Marcus arrived that evening to help her with the last of her things, Evelyn felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. She had always imagined a future with him, one that was free from Richard's shadow, but she hadn't anticipated it coming under such dire circumstances. And as they carried her boxes down the stairs, an unspoken tension lingered between them, a weight that neither of them could shake. Once they'd loaded everything into his car, they sat in silence, the enormity of her situation pressing down on them. Marcus reached for her hand, squeezing it gently, but even his touch couldn't dispel the dread that gnawed at her. She forced herself to meet his gaze, hoping to find reassurance, but instead, she saw something else. Hesitation, a flicker of doubt. "Are you sure about this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "About us?" Marcus hesitated, his fingers loosening slightly around hers. "Evelyn, I need to know something," he began, his voice low. "Did you ever plan to leave him? Before all of this?" The question caught her off guard, cutting through her defenses like a blade. She felt her cheeks flush, her mind racing as she struggled to find an answer that wouldn't betray the complexity of her feelings. The truth was, she hadn't planned any of this, hadn't dared to imagine a life without Richard's influence. Her affair with Marcus had been a reprieve, a taste of freedom, but she had never fully considered leaving her husband until now. I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I wanted to, but I was afraid. Afraid of what he might do, of what it would mean." Marcus's face softened, but the doubt remained, lingering like a shadow. "So, this was just an escape for you," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "A way to feel something, without actually risking anything." Evelyn felt a pang of guilt, her heart sinking as she realized the truth in his words. She had used Marcus as a sanctuary, a way to fill the emptiness in her life without confronting the reality of her situation. And now, as everything fell apart, she was clinging to him, expecting him to bear the weight of choices she had been too afraid to make. "Marcus, I'm sorry," she whispered, reaching for his hand, but he pulled away, his expression hardening. "No, Evelyn, I need to know. Did you ever love me? Or was this just a fantasy for you?" The question hung in the air, a brutal demand for honesty that left her feeling exposed. She searched his face, trying to find the right words, but the truth was too raw, too painful. She had loved him, yes, but in a way that was tangled with her own need for escape, her own fear of facing the emptiness of her life. "I did love you," she said finally, her voice cracking. "But I think I loved what you represented more. Freedom. A life that was mine. I don't know if that makes it real." Marcus's face fell, the hurt evident in his eyes. He turned away, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "So, I was just a means to an end," he muttered, shaking his head. I thought you saw me, that we were building something real." Evelyn felt a wave of desperation rising within her, the realization that she was losing him, that the only person who had ever made her feel alive was slipping away. "Please, Marcus, don't say that. I do care about you. I need you." He looked at her, a mixture of sadness and anger etched across his face. "No, Evelyn, you don't need me. You need someone to fill the void he left, someone to make you feel whole. But I can't be that person anymore." The words were a knife to her heart, each one driving home the depth of her betrayal, not just of Richard but of Marcus as well. She had used him, perhaps without even realizing it, turning him into a lifeline she hadn't truly committed to. And now, as her life lay in ruins, she was left with nothing. Marcus reached for the door, pausing only briefly. "I'm sorry, Evelyn, but I can't be part of this anymore. I hope you find what you're looking for, but it won't be with me." He left without another word, his footsteps echoing in the silence as he walked away, leaving her standing alone amid the wreckage of her choices. Evelyn felt a hollowness settle over her, a painful void that swallowed every shred of hope she had clung to. As she watched him disappear into the night, the reality of her situation crashed over her, an inescapable wave of despair. She had lost everything: her husband, her lover, her home. The life she had once held so tightly had slipped through her fingers, leaving her stranded in the darkness, with no one to blame but herself. And for the first time, she understood the full cost of her decisions, the weight of the betrayal she had inflicted on everyone around her, including herself. Evelyn sank to her knees, a sob escaping her lips as she realized that she was truly, utterly alone. Evelyn sat across from Richard's lawyer in a sterile office overlooking the city. The skyscrapers outside seemed to mock her, towering reminders of the world she once inhabited, a world she was now being forcibly removed from. The lawyer, a man with steely eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, shuffled through a stack of papers, each one filled with legal jargon that detailed the terms of her divorce. He looked up, his expression impassive. "Mrs. Grayson, per Mr. Grayson's instructions, you have until Friday to vacate the premises. The terms of the prenuptial agreement dictate that you are entitled to a modest financial settlement, enough to sustain you, but the assets, property, and any other holdings will remain under Mr. Grayson's control." Evelyn's stomach twisted as she listened, each word cutting deeper. She had known, of course, that Richard would fight to retain control of his wealth, but hearing the stark finality of it spelled out like this was something else entirely. It was as if her life was being erased, piece by piece, reduced to the bare minimum of survival. The lawyer continued, oblivious to her despair. "You will also need to sign a confidentiality agreement. Mr. Grayson expects complete discretion regarding the details of your marriage and any events leading to the separation. Failure to comply will result in legal action, including the forfeiture of any financial support." The words hung heavy in the air, a warning cloaked in legality. Richard had always been meticulous, and now, he was making sure that Evelyn's fall from grace was as complete and controlled as possible. She realized, with a bitter pang, that he had orchestrated her demise with the same ruthless efficiency he used in his business dealings. She forced herself to speak, her voice thin but steady. "What am I supposed to do? After all these years, you're leaving me with almost nothing?" The lawyer's gaze didn't waver. "These are the terms you agreed to when you signed the prenuptial agreement. I'm simply enforcing them on Mr. Grayson's behalf." Evelyn felt a surge of anger, but she held it back, knowing that any display of emotion would only be used against her. She signed her name on the documents, her hand trembling as she added the final mark that would sever her from the life she had once known. With each stroke of the pen, she felt a piece of herself slipping away, swallowed by the cold reality of her choices. As she handed the papers back, the lawyer nodded curtly. "Thank you, Mrs. Grayson. Someone will be in touch to arrange your departure from the property." He stood, signaling the end of their meeting, and Evelyn followed him out of the office, numb and hollow. She wandered through the city streets, lost in a haze of despair. She felt invisible, like a ghost haunting the places she had once frequented. Everything around her seemed to move on, indifferent to the devastation she carried within. Returning to the house later that evening, Evelyn walked through the empty rooms, her footsteps echoing in the vast, silent spaces. The staff avoided her gaze, their expressions carefully neutral, but she sensed their judgment, the whispers that likely circulated in her absence. She had become an object of pity, a cautionary tale of what happened to those who crossed Richard Grayson. She found herself in her bedroom, the one space that had felt like hers in this enormous, cold house. It was still beautifully arranged, each piece of furniture carefully selected, every surface gleaming, but now it felt like a museum exhibit, static, untouched, and about to be abandoned. Evelyn sank onto the bed, her hands clutching the edge of the mattress as she tried to steady herself. The full weight of her situation pressed down on her, an unbearable sense of loss and regret. She had wanted freedom, had craved it with every fiber of her being, but the freedom she now faced was hollow, devoid of the security and warmth she had taken for granted. The silence was broken by the sound of a car pulling up outside. She moved to the window and watched as Richard stepped out, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable. He entered the house, and a few moments later, she heard his footsteps approaching her room. He opened the door, his face calm and impassive. For a brief moment, she saw the man she had once admired, the man who had swept her into his world with promises of love and loyalty. But now, all she saw was a stranger, a man who viewed her as nothing more than a liability to be managed. "Evelyn," he said, his tone cold, "I trust you understand the gravity of your situation." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and desperation. "Richard, I know I hurt you, but I never thought you'd be so ruthless." He raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Ruthless? Evelyn, you brought this on yourself. I gave you everything, and you threw it away for a fling with a man who could never offer you a fraction of what I did." His words cut deep, but Evelyn refused to show her pain. "Maybe I wanted something you couldn't give me, Richard. Something real." He scoffed, his expression hardening. "Real? Let me make this very clear, Evelyn. This," he gestured around the room, around the life he had created for them. "This was real. What you did was a fantasy, a betrayal." She looked away, her resolve crumbling as she realized the futility of trying to make him understand. There was no redemption here, no chance of forgiveness, only the cold, calculated terms of her departure, enforced with the same unyielding control that had defined their entire marriage. He turned to leave, but paused at the door, casting one last glance back at her. "Be out by Friday," he said, his voice final, devoid of any warmth or compassion. "And remember, if you violate the terms of our agreement, you'll regret it." With that, he left, his footsteps fading down the hall, leaving her alone in the room that had once been her sanctuary. Evelyn sat in the silence, her heart heavy, knowing that her last connection to the life she had built was now irrevocably severed. As the reality sank in, she felt a numbness settle over her, a resignation to the fate she had chosen. She had gambled everything for a taste of freedom, and now she was left with nothing but the bitter consequences of her actions. Evelyn's world unraveled quickly after Richard's ultimatum. The story of her affair, her fall from grace, leaked to the press with shocking speed, and within days, her name was splashed across tabloids and news sites. Headlines labeled her everything from the disgraced wife to the billionaire's betrayal. Each headline felt like a public sentence, a brutal judgment laid down by a world that once celebrated her. When Evelyn stepped outside, she was greeted by flashes of cameras, journalists swarming to capture every painful detail of her downfall. She tried to keep her head down, her sunglasses shielding her from the blinding lights, but there was no escaping their probing questions, each one hitting her like a slap. "Evelyn, how does it feel to lose everything?" Is it true that your lover left you too? Do you have any regrets? Each question stung, each flash of light burning her deeper into the harsh reality of her choices. She had once been a darling of high society, the elegant Mrs. Grayson, a symbol of refinement and success. Now, she was reduced to a scandal, an object of public ridicule. Her past friends and allies had turned their backs on her, afraid to be associated with someone tarnished by disgrace. She was alone in the world she once ruled, stripped of the comfort and dignity she had taken for granted. She managed to push her way past the journalists, ducking into a taxi as the crowd of reporters pressed in on her. As the car pulled away, Evelyn leaned back, her hands trembling, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt as though she were being chased by a ghost of her former self, the polished, untouchable Evelyn Grayson who had vanished, leaving only a shell of what she once had been. The driver glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his eyes lingering on her disheveled appearance. She felt the weight of his silent judgment, as if he, too, knew everything about her downfall, everything about the life she had thrown away. The humiliation cut through her like a blade, an agony that no amount of hiding could dull. Later, as she arrived at her temporary apartment, a sparse, unfamiliar space with none of the comforts of her old life, she sank onto the couch, numb. She had no one to call, no one to confide in. Marcus was gone. Richard had cast her aside, and the friends who once clung to her at every social event had evaporated, fearful of the scandal that now followed her like a dark cloud. In the quiet of her new home, Evelyn turned on the television, her hands trembling as she flipped through the channels. She paused on a familiar face, Richard, standing at a podium at a corporate event, looking polished and dignified, a man untarnished by the scandal that had wrecked her life. He was fielding questions from reporters, his expression calm and collected, a faint smile gracing his lips as he addressed the incident. "I prefer not to discuss my personal life," he was saying, his tone steady, poised. "But I will say that my focus remains on my work, on the people who have supported me through this difficult time. I am grateful for their understanding and compassion." The reporter pressed him further. "What about Evelyn? Are the rumors true that she's been left with nothing?" Richard's smile widened, almost imperceptibly, a flicker of satisfaction in his gaze. "Evelyn and I have parted ways amicably. I wish her all the best in her future endeavors." Evelyn felt a surge of anger rise within her as she watched him, the subtle dig in his words twisting the knife deeper. To him, this was nothing more than a minor inconvenience, a blemish on his reputation that he could easily erase, while she was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. He had effectively rewritten their story, painting himself as the dignified victim, while she was cast as the villain, a footnote in his pristine narrative. Unable to watch any longer, Evelyn turned off the television, the silence of the apartment settling over her like a shroud. The walls seemed to close in around her, each shadow a reminder of the emptiness she now faced, of the choices that had led her to this point. She had sought freedom, a life beyond the constraints of her marriage, but in her search, she had lost everything that had once defined her. Days passed in a blur, each one a repetition of the last. She avoided the streets, hiding from the public eye, but the headlines continued to haunt her, reminders of a life she could never reclaim. Her only solace was the anonymity of her new existence, the knowledge that, at the very least, she could disappear, fade from the spotlight, even if it meant fading from the world entirely. One afternoon, as she walked through a quiet park, Evelyn overheard a conversation between two women on a nearby bench. Their voices were hushed, but the words were clear. "Did you hear about Evelyn Grayson? Imagine throwing all that away for a fling. It's a pity, really. She had everything, and now, she's got nothing." The words hit her like a physical blow, and she turned away, quickening her pace, her cheeks burning with shame. She had become a cautionary tale, a whispered warning to others, a symbol of recklessness and betrayal. As she returned to her apartment, Evelyn sank into a chair, her mind swirling with bitterness and regret. She had traded security for freedom, but in doing so, she had become a prisoner of her own choices. She was trapped in a life that was now defined by loss, by the scandal that would forever follow her. a stain that could never be erased. In the solitude of her apartment, Evelyn began to understand the full extent of her punishment. She had sought a life beyond the gilded cage of her marriage, a life of her own choosing, but that freedom had come at a devastating cost. Now, all she had left was the silence, the endless stretch of empty days, and the knowledge that the world she had once known had moved on, leaving her behind in the shadows. And as the sun set outside her window, casting long shadows across the room, Evelyn felt the weight of her choices settle over her, a burden she would carry for the rest of her days. She was alone, a ghost of her former self, haunted by the life she had lost and the freedom that had led her to ruin. Evelyn's days blended together in a monotonous cycle of regret and solitude. Her new apartment, a stark contrast to the opulent mansion she had once called home, was a small, unremarkable space with bare walls and minimal furniture. It felt more like a temporary shelter than a place to rebuild a life. Every morning, she woke up hoping the nightmare would end, but the bleakness of her reality remained, inescapable and unforgiving. Her finances dwindled rapidly. The modest settlement from Richard, once enough to cover basic needs, was now a constant source of anxiety. Evelyn had been shielded from financial worries for so long that she was ill-prepared for the demands of budgeting and the limitations of her newfound lifestyle. Gone were the days of personal shoppers, high-end dinners, and luxurious trips. Now, each grocery run required careful calculation, every dollar accounted for with painstaking precision. To make ends meet, Evelyn took on small jobs, freelance writing and editing assignments that offered little pay but required the long hours she now had in abundance. The work felt menial, a far cry from the glamorous life she'd once led. She often found herself surrounded by younger colleagues who barely knew who she was, indifferent to the scandal that had once shaken high society. She had become invisible, a woman fading into the shadows of a world that had once revolved around her. The few friends who had initially reached out had gradually drifted away. She couldn't bear their pity, the uncomfortable glances and strained smiles that seemed to say, "How could you let it come to this?" Evelyn couldn't answer that question herself. She had lost her way, lost sight of who she was beyond the polished facade, and now she was paying the price with a life stripped of meaning. One evening, Evelyn decided to attend an art show she had seen advertised in a local paper. It was a modest event, nothing like the glamorous gallery openings she had once frequented, but the thought of seeing art again stirred something within her, a flicker of the passion she had shared with Marcus. She arrived alone, clutching her worn purse tightly, a wave of nostalgia washing over her as she stepped into the small, dimly lit gallery. She wandered through the exhibit, taking in the pieces on display, but none of them held the same power that Marcus's work had possessed. It was then, as she moved toward the back of the gallery, that she saw it, a large canvas, swirling with colors she recognized instantly. It was unmistakably Marcus's work. Her heart raced as she approached, her eyes tracing the familiar brushstrokes, the bold, chaotic beauty that had drawn her to him from the very beginning. The painting was a raw, unfiltered expression of emotion, a piece that seemed to reach into the soul and lay it bare. And as she stared at it, she felt a pang of regret so sharp it nearly took her breath away. In that moment, she remembered the dreams they had shared, the plans they had whispered to each other in stolen moments. She had thought she could find freedom with him, that they could build a life outside the confines of her marriage. But now, standing alone in a gallery filled with strangers, she realized just how much she had lost. As she turned to leave, she saw a familiar figure across the room. Marcus, speaking with a group of admirers, his face animated as he explained the story behind his work. He looked happy, his smile genuine, his eyes filled with a warmth she remembered all too well. She felt a surge of longing, a deep ache for the life they might have had if things had been different. Evelyn took a step forward, her hand instinctively reaching up to smooth her hair, but she stopped herself. What was she thinking? She was no longer part of his world, no longer the woman he had once cared for. To him, she was likely a memory, a chapter closed, and the last thing she wanted was to tarnish his success by dredging up the past. She slipped out of the gallery, the cool night air hitting her like a slap. The ache in her chest was almost unbearable, a reminder of everything she had lost. Not just Marcus, but the version of herself that had dared to dream of something more. She walked aimlessly through the streets, her mind a whirlwind of regret and remorse. Back at her apartment, Evelyn poured herself a glass of cheap wine and sat by the window, staring out at the city lights. She thought of Richard, of the life she had once shared with him, a life that had been built on illusions and expectations. She had traded that life for the promise of freedom, but in the end, her choices had left her with nothing but emptiness. The scandal had faded from the headlines, but the consequences lingered, etched into the fabric of her existence. She was no longer Evelyn Grayson, the polished socialite, the billionaire's wife. She was simply Evelyn, a woman stripped of status, wealth, and reputation, a woman forced to confront the reality of her decisions. As she sipped her wine, Evelyn allowed herself to feel the weight of it all, the loneliness, the isolation, the relentless questions that haunted her every waking moment. Had it been worth it? Was freedom worth the cost of losing everything she had once held dear? A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Startled, she set down her glass and opened the door to find her neighbor, an elderly woman who lived down the hall. She held a small potted plant in her hands, her face soft with kindness. "I thought you might like a little company," the woman said, her voice gentle. "You seem like you've been lonely." Evelyn felt a lump form in her throat, and she managed a weak smile. "Thank you," she whispered, taking the plant and inviting the woman inside. They sat together, the woman chatting about her day, filling the empty space with stories that were simple yet comforting. For the first time in months, Evelyn felt a glimmer of something she had thought she'd lost forever, a sense of connection, however small. She realized that while her life would never be what it once was, she still had the power to choose how she would live the days that stretched before her. As the evening wore on and her neighbor eventually left, Evelyn placed the plant on her windowsill, watching as the first hints of dawn crept over the city. The world outside was still, the sky a soft gray, and in that quiet moment, Evelyn felt a flicker of hope, a faint reminder that life, however shattered, could still hold moments of grace. She would carry the scars of her choices, would forever be marked by the life she had lost. But as she looked at the small green plant, its leaves stretching toward the light, she understood that her story wasn't over. She had lost everything she had once thought defined her, but she was still here, still standing. In the silence of her apartment, Evelyn made a quiet vow to herself. She would find a way to rebuild, to redefine what her life could be. It wouldn't be easy, and she knew there would be days when the regret would threaten to swallow her whole. But for now, she had one small thing to nurture, a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even the most broken lives could find a way to grow again.